Hi everyone, my name is Kaitlin Moreno, and today I'm going to be talking about styled components, which is a JavaScript library created by Max Stoiber and Glenn Mattern. I'm going to be talking a bit about how to use it today, but I mainly wanted to focus on the ideas behind it. The reason I found this library so compelling is that it basically takes the best practices of component-based architecture and applies it to CSS and styling. So even if you don't end up using this library, I hope it will get you to think about harnessing the power of components in your styling. So we are living in the age of components. UI design is centered around creating modular, reusable blocks that we can fit together to create complex applications. This is great for us as developers. It keeps our code dry because we can reuse components easily. That saves time when we're building our app, and it also saves time when we want to maintain our code if we need to make changes later on. If you only have to change something in one place, it's easy to locate and the changes will be made across your app. It's also easier to understand the layout of an application, especially when you're collaborating with other developers. It also creates a better user experience. It provides consistent user interactions with your application across all the different views. This goes back to updating and making changes as a developer. If you aren't using components and make a change somewhere and then forget to do it somewhere else, that can cause big problems for your user. So component-based architecture also follows some overarching programming principles. One of these is called single responsibility. This means that every module or class should have a responsibility over a single part of the functionality of your software. So in component-based systems, we can see this principle in the idea of stateful container components versus presentational components, because it separates our concerns. If we're getting an error with an AJAX request or seeing the wrong data, we know to check our container. If we're seeing a problem with the view, we should check our presentational component. Now let's talk about how we can take some of these great things about components and apply them to CSS. Here's a great quote by this developer, Michael Chan. If you're writing React, you have access to a more powerful styling construct than CSS class names. You have components. So obviously, CSS doesn't have modules or components, but what he's talking about here is that we can elevate our CSS if we apply our understanding of solid programming principles and best practices. And we as developers can gain a lot of the benefits from component-based design that we talked a minute ago about, like speed, drier code, changeability. So let's take a look at this example. We have an input here with two class names. Depending on the scale of this application, we might use this input in a few different places. Now, if we did this, if we did this and made it into its own component, it might seem a little silly at first because not a lot changed, but what we've done is actually separated out our concerns by abstracting away the implementation details. So now the class name and type are a lower level concern. We don't really care about those. We just want it to work. I'm no longer adding these things to every single one of my inputs. So it's drier. It's also easily changeable. If I decide to try a new class or a new library, I can make those changes in one place. Now I can take this even further. Say I don't really want to always have an input that's text, and I want to be able to customize it to use in different situations. I might also want to add other attributes in certain cases, so I'll need to be able to pass it props. So here I'm setting my default type to text and then using the spread operator to give it any additional props that I might need. And then with this, I can now make even more specific components, but I'm still only ever using this one main input component. And I'm giving all of these a single responsibility. So then I could render something like this. And it's very clear, very easy to read. So these are the concepts behind the styled components library. You could do all that stuff by yourself. But the creators kind of took this a step further. They thought, just like with normal React components, if we can abstract away the implementation detail, we can write reusable code that becomes more powerful. So their idea was to actually attach styles directly to a component and completely remove the whole step of even having class names as a middleman between styles and components. Basically, if you think about it, a lot of these components will have their own unique class names or IDs, and they aren't used anywhere else. Just like our input component that had form control, we're probably not going to be using that on anything but input type components. And that's really best practice anyways, right? If we're not going to use a button class on an image. That would be messy, hard to maintain, and especially hard to collaborate. So that's what he's talking about here with enforcing best practices. So how does it work? Let's say we want to have an H1 and style it. Normally we would do something like this. There's an H1 with a class of title, and then we put it on our element. With styled components, it'll look like this. First, we import the styled function from styled components. Then we can attach methods onto it to create certain components. Here we're adding an H1 method to it, and it will return a React component, which then renders an H1 with these attached styles. And as a side note, you might be wondering what's going on here with these backticks. That's actually, it has nothing to do with styled components. It's an ES6 feature called tag template literals. And they are really the magic behind how this library is working. They're basically like template literals where you can interpolate variables into a string, but you can actually call functions with them. It's almost the same as calling it with parentheses like this, but the differences really come with how it deals with arguments. But basically, the backticks let you receive variables or functions, and then they can flatten that out into plain CSS. Tag template literals are super interesting, and I'm going to include some resources at the end if you're curious about how this is working. But just know that this is kind of what's allowing you to write CSS in your JavaScript. So here we created a new React component that renders the H1 with these styles. So it's quite literal. Instead of styling a class or an element, we're styling a component directly and now can use it across our application. We totally removed CSS classes as an intermediary step between components and styles. Just like with our input example, this is much more readable. So what's really cool about this is how styled components use props to customize the behavior of a component. And this is one of the great benefits of CSS in JavaScript. So say we want to have a title component to be able to have a primary version where it's a little bit bigger. We can adapt our font family and size by passing an actual function as a style value. Now we can switch styles based on an incoming prop value rather than appending a new class to our HTML like when using classic CSS. This gives us a pretty significant reduction in lines of code. Another great feature is that you can also pass in components to the styled method, either your own components or one from third-party libraries. So this is an example of using one of React Router's link components. And now we're creating this new styled link that has the same functionality, but styled. And then another example here, I have like my own box component that I'm rendering, and then I'm composing a whole new element highlighted box with some more styles added onto it. So the last thing I want to highlight about this library is how awesome it can be for creating super readable, maintainable code. Here I have this card component that I was using for a project, and this is what my JSX looked like before. So it's fine. There's a lot of divs, a lot of class names. And this is what it can look like with styled components. So now it has a very clear semantic component hierarchy, and it's very readable and maintainable, with each component having a clear single responsibility. So to summarize, the styled components library lets you generate React components that actually render out elements with styles attached. This means that when you're defining your styles, you're actually creating a normal React component. In this way, styled components remove the need for class names as a mapping between the components and its styles. This enforces best practices in component-based architecture by giving each component a single responsibility. And this leads to much more readable hierarchy in your JSX. And because we're writing CSS in our JavaScript, this means we can actually set functions to be style values and then modify those values based on any props that we pass in. This allows for way less CSS. There are a lot more things to talk about. Style components also have supports for theming, mixins, React Native. It's Really great stuff. So if you're interested, here are some resources that I used. Feel free to look through these if you're curious and want to learn more. Thanks.